Block 1, Charleston Harbor, 1863. The air thick with salt and gunpowder residue. The Union Army had been hammering at Confederate positions for months, slowly tightening the noose around the city. But taking Charleston wasn't just about firepower. It was about knowing the water, the channels, the shoals, the places where the tide could swallow an ironclad whole if you miscalculated by 10 feet. Robert Smalls stood on the deck of a Union transport ship, watching white officers study maps that were already outdated. He'd been wearing Union blue for over a year now, since that night in May of 1862 when he'd stolen the planter right out from under Confederate guns and delivered her, crew, families, and all, straight into the hands of the Union Navy. That act alone should have made him invaluable. Instead, it made him suspicious. The officers tolerated him. Sometimes they asked questions. Mostly they looked past him the way you look past furniture. Captain Marcus Holbrook was different. He didn't look past Robert Smalls. He looked at him with active contempt. Holbrook had arrived from Massachusetts 3 weeks earlier, appointed to oversee a critical river operation that would flank Confederate artillery positions and open a route for Union troops to advance on the peninsula. He was West Point educated, 32 years old, and certain that his training had prepared him for every tactical situation the South could present. During the briefing, Holbrook spread a naval chart across the table in the cramped officer's cabin. His finger traced a route up the Stono River, past James Island toward the Confederate rear positions. It was bold. It was aggressive. It was also suicide. Robert Smalls had been asked to attend the briefing, not as an equal. He stood near the door, hands behind his back, present but not invited to the table. He watched Holbrook's finger move along the chart and felt something cold settle in his chest. When Holbrook finished outlining the plan, one of the junior officers hesitated. "Sir," he said, "what about the mud flats near Grimball's Landing? The charts show deep water, but I've heard—" Holbrook cut him off. "You've heard rumors from locals, Lieutenant. I'm following United States Navy survey data. This channel has been marked as navigable for vessels drawing up to 8 feet. We'll be using shallow draft boats, 6 feet maximum. We'll have clearance." Robert Smalls shifted his weight. He didn't speak. Holbrook noticed the movement. His eyes snapped toward the door. Something to add, Smalls? It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Robert kept his face neutral. "Captain, that channel floods and drains with the tide. The charts show the depth at high water. If you enter at the wrong time—" Holbrook's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting that my navigation is inadequate?" "No, sir. I'm saying the water there changes. I've piloted that stretch more than 100 times. If you time it wrong, you'll ground every boat before you reach the bend." Holbrook stepped away from the table. He moved slowly, deliberately, until he stood directly in front of Robert Smalls. The cabin went quiet. The junior officers looked at their boots. "You've piloted it," Holbrook said softly, "as a slave, running errands for your masters, ferrying cargo like a pack mule with a wheel. That doesn't make you a navigator, Smalls. It makes you a tool they used. And now you presume to correct me? An officer of the United States Army? A graduate of the finest military academy in this country?" Robert didn't answer. Holbrook leaned in. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every man in that cabin heard it. "You forget your place. You're not one of us. You never will be. The fact that you wear that uniform is a courtesy, not a rank. You're here because General Hunter thought it might be useful to have a pet who knows the local waters. But don't mistake that for authority. You don't give advice to white officers. You take orders. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Holbrook turned back to the table. "Gentlemen, we launch at 0400 hours. Tide is irrelevant. We move fast, we move quiet. We hit them before they know we're there. Dismissed." The officers filed out. Robert Smalls remained near the door for a moment, staring at the chart still spread on the table. The route Holbrook had drawn cut straight through a section of river that turned to exposed mud for 6 hours out of every 12. He'd seen Confederate ships stranded there. He'd seen Union gunboats attempt the passage and fail. But he'd also seen the look in Holbrook's eyes. The contempt. The certainty. There would be no changing his mind. Not with facts. Not with experience. Robert Smalls had stolen a Confederate warship, navigated through minefields in the dark, and delivered military intelligence that had saved Union lives. None of it mattered, not to men like Holbrook. So Robert Smalls did what he'd learned to do since childhood. He stayed quiet. He watched. He waited. The plan went forward. 400 hours came cold and black. 12 boats assembled at the staging point, low-draft transports loaded with 2 companies of infantry, ammunition, medical supplies, and enough firepower to hold a position once they secured it. Holbrook commanded from the lead vessel. Robert Smalls was assigned to the 3rd boat in the line, technically listed as a pilot but functionally a deckhand. Nobody asked him about the route. Nobody checked the tide tables. They moved upriver in silence, oars muffled with cloth, engines kept low. The water was dark as oil, reflecting nothing. For the first 30 minutes, everything went according to Holbrook's plan. The boats slipped past the outer Confederate pickets unnoticed. They rounded the first bend without incident. Holbrook sent a hand signal down the line. Steady, quiet, perfect. Then they hit the flats. It didn't happen all at once. The lead boat slowed first, dragging slightly as the hull scraped bottom. Holbrook ordered more speed. The engine strained. The boat lurched forward another 20 yards, then stopped, dead in the water, stuck. The second boat tried to veer around it. Same result. Grounded. Within 5 minutes, 8 of the 12 boats were locked in place, keels buried in thick river mud that held them like a fist. The tide was still falling. In another hour, they'd be sitting ducks on exposed mud banks visible from both shores. Holbrook stood in the bow of his boat, staring at the nightmare unfolding around him. His voice cracked when he gave the order. All boats, reverse engines, full power. Get us out of here. They couldn't. The more the engines churned, the deeper the boat settled. Panic spread fast among the infantry. Men started jumping into the shallows, trying to push the boats free. The water was only waist-deep now, and dropping. The noise carried. From the western shore, a Confederate sentry heard the commotion. A single rifle shot cracked through the darkness, then another. Within minutes, the entire southern bank erupted with muzzle flashes. The Union soldiers in the stranded boats scrambled for cover, returning fire blindly into the trees. It was chaos. Men screaming, officers shouting contradictory orders, boats taking fire from positions they couldn't see. Holbrook's voice cut through the noise, raw and desperate. "Smalls! Where the hell is Smalls?" Robert Smalls was already moving. He'd seen this coming the moment the lead boat slowed. While the others panicked, he'd been calculating. Tide, time, depth, distance. There was a channel. Not the one on Holbrook's chart. A narrow cut that hugged the northern bank, deeper, sheltered by a curve in the land. Locals knew it. Smugglers used it. The Navy had never bothered to survey it because it wasn't on their maps. He found Holbrook crouched behind the gunwale, hat gone, face pale in the muzzle flashlight. The captain's eyes locked onto him with something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite fear. It was the look of a man who'd just realized he was drowning. "Can you get us out?" Holbrook's voice was stripped of everything except necessity. Robert Smalls looked at the river, at the boats, at the men dying because someone had refused to listen. He could leave them, walk away, let the system that humiliated him choke on its own arrogance. Nobody would blame him. Nobody would even know. But he'd never been that kind of man. "There's a channel," Robert said. "Northern side, narrow. Deep enough if we move now. We'll have to go single file. Slow. If anyone panics and runs the boats aground again, we're done." Holbrook stared at him. "Can you pilot it?" "Yes, sir, then do it, now." Robert moved to the helm of the nearest boat that still had some mobility. He signaled the others to follow, one by one, forming a tight line. He ignored the Confederate fire, ignored the screams, ignored everything except the feel of the water and the memory of 100 trips through this river when he'd belonged to someone else. He nosed the first boat into the hidden channel. The hull scraped once, adjusted, then slid into deeper water. The second boat followed, then the third. One by one, he pulled them out of the killing zone, through the dark, through water that the Union Navy didn't know existed, piloted by a man they'd called a tool. It took 2 hours. By the time the last boat cleared the flats, the eastern sky was starting to gray. They'd lost 4 men, 14 wounded, 3 boats abandoned. The mission was a failure. There would be no flank attack, no strategic advantage. Just a frantic retreat back to Union lines carrying the wreckage of Holbrook's certainty. When they finally reached safe water, Holbrook found Robert Smalls on the deck of the lead boat. The captain looked 10 years older. His uniform was soaked with river water and blood that wasn't his. He stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he spoke. Quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the engine. "You tried to tell me, yes, sir. Why didn't you insist?" Robert Smalls looked at the man who'd humiliated him in front of other officers, who'd called him a tool, who'd nearly killed 2 companies of Union soldiers because he couldn't imagine that a black man might know something a West Point graduate didn't. "With respect, Captain, you didn't want to hear it." Holbrook had no answer for that. He turned and walked away, and Robert Smalls never spoke to him again. The incident was quietly buried in official reports. Holbrook was reassigned to a desk position in Washington within a month. No court-martial, no public reprimand. The Army didn't want to admit that one of its officers had nearly caused a massacre because he refused to listen to a former slave. But the men who were there knew. The junior officers knew. The soldiers who'd been trapped in those boats knew. And word spread the way it always does in an army, whispered in mess tents and around campfires. The story of the captain who thought his education made him smarter than the man who'd lived the water his whole life. The story of Robert Smalls, who saved men who wouldn't have saved him. And slowly, quietly, something began to shift. Not in the official records, not in the promotions or the commendations, but in the way certain officers started asking Robert Smalls for his opinion before they made a move. In the way his name started appearing in operational briefings, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. In the way the system, arrogant and slow, began to realize that survival sometimes depends on listening to the people you've spent generations trying to silence. Robert Smalls didn't gloat. He didn't demand recognition. He just kept doing what he'd always done. Watching, learning, waiting for the moment when the system's blindness would create an opening. Because he understood something that men like Holbrook never would. Power isn't just about who gives the orders. It's about who knows the water, who understands the tide, who can see the invisible channels that don't appear on any map. And in that knowledge, quiet and patient and absolutely unshakable, there was a kind of power that no academy could teach and no rank could grant. The kind that saves lives, or ends them, depending on whether anyone is wise enough to listen. The Stono River incident became a ghost that haunted the Union command structure in ways nobody anticipated. It wasn't discussed in official channels. There was no investigation, no inquiry. But in the informal networks that exist in every military organization, the story circulated like a virus, mutating slightly with each retelling, but always preserving its essential truth. A white officer had refused counsel from a black pilot. Men had nearly died. The black pilot had saved them anyway. For Robert Smalls, nothing changed immediately. He still wore the same uniform, still received the same dismissive glances from certain officers, still had to prove himself in ways that white men never did. But something had shifted in the molecular structure of how the Union Army operated in the coastal theater. Certain commanders, the ones who cared more about winning than maintaining the racial hierarchy, started seeking him out, not publicly, not in ways that would draw attention, but when they needed to navigate the labyrinth of rivers and inlets around Charleston, when they needed intelligence about Confederate positions, when they needed someone who understood the terrain in ways no map could capture, they came to Robert Smalls, and he delivered. Every single time, he piloted Union gunboats through passages that Confederate forces thought were impassable. He identified weak points in rebel defenses that Northern strategists had overlooked. He provided detailed information about troop movements, supply routes, fortification strengths, all drawn from years of observation while the Confederacy had assumed he was invisible. Because that's what they'd always assumed, that a man who'd been enslaved couldn't be paying attention, couldn't be making mental maps, couldn't be preparing for the day when that knowledge would matter. By the fall of 1863, Robert Smalls had become what the military calls a force multiplier, One man whose expertise amplified the effectiveness of entire operations. He wasn't given a commission. He wasn't promoted through official channels. But he was given something potentially more valuable. He was given access to planning sessions, to intelligence briefings, to the decision-makers who understood that ideology was a luxury they couldn't afford when lives were on the line. The Navy recognized this before the Army did. In December of 1863, Robert Smalls was assigned as pilot of the USS Keokuk, an ironclad monitor that had been salvaged and repaired after taking severe damage in an earlier assault on Charleston's defenses. It was a significant assignment, the kind usually reserved for experienced white pilots with years of documented service. The appointment raised eyebrows, generated quiet complaints among officers who believed the chain of command should reflect the social order they were comfortable with. But Admiral John Dahlgren, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, had made a calculation. He needed Charleston. The Confederacy needed Charleston. Whoever controlled that port controlled a critical supply line and a powerful symbol. Dahlgren had lost men trying to take it through conventional means. He needed an edge. Robert Smalls was that edge. The Keokuk assignment put Robert in direct contact with naval officers who hadn't been present at the Stono River debacle, men who knew his reputation but hadn't witnessed the specific incident. Among them was Lieutenant Commander William Sinclair, a career Navy officer from Virginia, who'd stayed loyal to the Union despite his family's Confederate sympathies. Sinclair was competent, methodical, and carried the casual prejudices of his upbringing like a second skin. He didn't actively hate black people. He simply didn't consider them fully human in the way he considered himself and his peers human. When Sinclair learned that Robert Smalls would be piloting the Keokuk during a reconnaissance mission near Fort Sumter, his reaction was precisely calibrated contempt. He didn't object loudly. He didn't file a formal complaint. He simply made it clear through tone and body language that he considered the assignment an insult to professional naval standards. The mission briefing took place on a cold January morning in 1864. The objective was straightforward on paper. Take the Keokuk close enough to Fort Sumter to assess recent modifications to the Confederate defenses, gather intelligence on artillery placements, and return without engaging unless fired upon. It was a reconnaissance run, not an assault. Speed and precision mattered more than firepower. Sinclair laid out his navigation plan with the confidence of someone who'd studied every available chart of Charleston Harbor. He intended to approach from the southeast, using a series of markers and known depth readings to guide the ironclad within observation range, then withdraw along the same route. It was safe, conservative, by the book. Robert Smalls studied the chart in silence. He saw the problem immediately. The route Sinclair had chosen would take them directly across a section of harbor bottom where the Confederates had been sinking obstacles. Not mines, exactly. Wooden pilings, submerged chains, debris from destroyed ships, all positioned to foul propellers and rudders. The Union Navy knew about some of these obstacles. The charts marked the ones that had been documented. But Robert knew about others. The ones the Confederates had placed in the last 2 months. The ones they'd positioned specifically to trap vessels following the standard approach routes. He'd learned about them from escaped slaves who'd worked on the construction crews, from fishermen who'd noticed the warning buoys the rebels had placed for their own ships, from careful observation during his previous reconnaissance runs. Information that existed nowhere in official Union intelligence because the people who possessed it were considered unreliable sources by the white officers who compiled the reports. Robert waited until Sinclair finished his briefing, then spoke carefully. "Commander, that approach puts us across the new obstacle field south of the fort. If we follow that bearing, we risk fouling the propeller or damaging the rudder." Sinclair's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. "The charts show clear water along that route, Smalls. Are you suggesting our naval cartographers are incompetent?" "No, sir. I'm saying the Confederates have added new obstacles since those charts were drawn. They've been working at night using small boats. The charts won't show them yet." Sinclair set down his compass with exaggerated patience. "And how exactly? Would you know about Confederate construction operations that our own intelligence services haven't detected? Information from local contacts, sir. People who've seen the work. Local contacts, Sinclair repeated. You mean slaves, runaways, people with every reason to lie or exaggerate to make themselves seem valuable. Robert kept his voice level. People with first-hand knowledge, sir. Sinclair stood up, signaling the briefing was over. I appreciate your concern, Smalls, but I'm not going to alter mission parameters based on rumors from unreliable sources. We'll follow the established route. If you're uncomfortable with that, I can request a different pilot. It was the same trap Holbrook had set. The same test. Follow orders that would lead to disaster or resist and be removed, proving you were the problem all along. Robert Smalls made the same choice he'd made before. Yes, sir. I'll pilot the route as ordered. The Keokuk departed at dawn. The harbor was calm, the water like dark glass. Robert stood at the helm, hands steady, eyes tracking the landmarks he'd memorized over years of navigation. Sinclair stood beside him, consulting his charts, calling out bearing adjustments with the precision of a man who trusted instruments over instinct. They approached Fort Sumter from the southeast, exactly as Sinclair had planned. The ironclad moved slowly, cautiously, engines running just fast enough to maintain steerage. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. They reached the observation point without incident. The crew began recording details of the fort's defenses, sketching artillery positions, counting gun emplacements. Then Robert felt it, a subtle change in the ship's movement. Not dramatic, just a slight drag, a hesitation in the way the Keokuk responded to the helm. He'd felt it before, on other ships, when the propeller was starting to catch on something submerged. He adjusted course slightly, trying to steer away from whatever was below them. But Sinclair noticed the deviation. Hold your course, Smalls. Maintain bearing 270. Sir, I'm feeling resistance in the helm. I think we're catching on something. Nonsense, the water here is clear. Hold your bearing. Robert held it. 5 seconds later, the propeller caught hard on a submerged chain. The engine strained, the whole ship shuddered, and then something in the drive system snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The Keokuk lurched, lost momentum, and began drifting with the current, directly toward the guns of Fort Sumter. Sinclair's face went white. All stop. Emergency reverse. The engine room responded, but with the propeller fouled and the drive shaft damaged, the ironclad had no power. They were dead in the water, 200 yards from one of the most heavily armed Confederate positions in the entire theater, drifting closer with every second. The rebel gunners saw them immediately. A Union ironclad, disabled, helpless, floating directly into their kill zone. It was a gift. They didn't hesitate. The first shell screamed overhead, missing by 20 feet. The second hit the water 30 yards short, sending up a geyser that drenched the deck. The third struck the Keokuk's armored casemate with a sound like the end of the world, a direct hit that rang through the entire ship like a bell. The armor held, but barely. Another hit in the same spot would punch through. Sinclair was shouting orders that no one could execute. Restore power, get us moving, return fire. But there was no power to restore, no way to maneuver, and returning fire would only confirm their position and invite more accurate shelling. Robert Smalls stood at the useless helm, watching the fort grow larger as the current carried them closer. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they drifted into point-blank range. 2 minutes before the Confederate gunners adjusted their aim and started putting shells through the Keokuk's armor like it was paper. He could see the same realization dawning on Sinclair's face. The commander's certainty was crumbling, replaced by the specific terror of a man who'd just killed himself and his entire crew through arrogance. Sinclair's eyes found Robert. His voice came out broken. Is there anything you can do? Robert looked at the water, at the current, at the wind, at Fort Sumter's guns tracking them like a predator watching wounded prey. He did the calculations in his head, the same way he'd been doing them since childhood. Angles, distances, possibilities. There was one chance. Maybe. We still have the anchor, Robert said. If we drop it now, the current will swing us around. We'll rotate stern first, but we might drift into the shallows north of the channel. Confederate guns can't depress low enough to hit us if we get close to shore." "That'll ground us," Sinclair said. "We're already dead if we stay here," Robert replied. Sinclair stared at him for 3 seconds. That felt like 3 hours. Then he made the only decision left to make. "Drop anchor. Now." The anchor plunged into the harbor. The chain screamed through the hawse hole, 50 feet, 75, 100, then caught. The Keokuk jerked hard, the bow swinging around just as another Confederate shell passed through the space they'd occupied 2 seconds earlier. The current took hold, pushing the disabled ironclad sideways, pulling them toward the shallows. The fort's gunners tried to adjust, but they were firing at a moving target that was now rotating and drifting simultaneously. Their shells fell long, then short, then long again. The Keokuk scraped bottom, shuddered, and came to rest in water too shallow for the big guns to target effectively. They were grounded, stuck, but alive, and more importantly, out of the kill zone. Sinclair collapsed against the rail, breathing like he'd just run a mile. The crew emerged from their battle stations, stunned that they weren't dead. Robert Smalls remained at the helm, hands still resting on the wheel that no longer controlled anything. It took 6 hours for Union tugboats to reach them, another 4 to pull the Keokuk free and tow her back to the repair yards. During that entire time, Sinclair didn't speak to Robert Smalls, didn't look at him, just sat in his cabin, staring at nothing, confronting whatever thoughts come to a man who's been saved by someone he'd considered beneath saving. The official report listed the incident as mechanical failure due to uncharted obstacles. No mention of ignored warnings. No mention of whose knowledge had been dismissed. The Navy didn't court Marshal Sinclair, but they didn't give him another command either. He finished the war behind a desk, processing supply requisitions. Robert Smalls returned to active duty within a week, piloting a different vessel. No commendation, no official recognition. But something had changed again. Another microscopic shift in the tectonic plates of institutional prejudice. More officers started asking his opinion. More commanders started checking their assumptions against his experience, not because they'd suddenly discovered moral clarity, because they'd discovered that ignoring him could get them killed. And that, Robert understood, was more valuable than respect. Fear was honest. Fear was practical. Fear could be worked with. Respect could be faked. But no one fakes being afraid to die. By the time Charleston finally fell to Union forces in February of 1865, Robert Smalls had participated in 17 military engagements. He'd piloted ships through minefields, guided troops through hostile territory, provided intelligence that shaped strategic decisions at the highest levels. He'd done all of this while being paid less than white pilots, denied the rank his experience warranted, and subjected to casual humiliation from officers who owed him their lives. After the war ended, he didn't fade into obscurity the way the system expected. He bought the house in Beaufort where his former owner had lived, the same house where he'd been enslaved as a child. He served 5 terms in the United States Congress. He fought for education, for civil rights, for the recognition that Black Americans had earned through blood and sacrifice. But he never forgot the lessons of the Stono River and Charleston Harbor. Never forgot that the system's greatest vulnerability was its arrogance, its absolute certainty that people it considered inferior couldn't possibly know something important, couldn't possibly see what educated men missed. That arrogance had nearly killed Union soldiers in a muddy river, had nearly destroyed an ironclad in Charleston Harbor, had nearly cost the North victories it desperately needed. Not because the Confederacy was stronger, because the Union couldn't imagine learning from a black man. And in the quiet moments when Robert Smalls sat in the house he'd once been forbidden to enter, except as property, he sometimes wondered how many other disasters the system had suffered because it refused to listen to the people who actually understood the terrain. How many battles lost because generals ignored scouts who'd lived on the land their entire lives. How many ships sunk because admirals dismissed pilots who knew the water. How many lives wasted because the men in charge believed their education mattered more than someone else's experience. The system never admitted this, of course, never acknowledged that its prejudices were tactical liabilities. It simply adjusted, slowly and reluctantly, making room for people it had tried to exclude, not out of justice, but out of necessity. Robert Smalls had forced that adjustment, not with violence, not with rhetoric, with patience, with knowledge, with the quiet confidence of a man who knew that survival in the end belongs to those who understand the water. And every officer who ever dismissed him, every commander who ever looked past him, every system that ever tried to reduce him to a tool or a pet or an inconvenience, learned the same hard lesson. You can humiliate a man. You can deny him rank, respect, recognition. You can build an entire civilization on the assumption that he doesn't matter. But you cannot change the tide. You cannot alter the depth of the channel. You cannot navigate water you don't understand, no matter how many degrees you hold or how much authority you claim. And when you're grounded in the mud, or drifting toward enemy guns, or watching your certainty crumble into panic, the man you humiliated might still save you. Not because you deserve it, but because he's better than the system that shaped you. That's the part that haunts, not the disaster, not the near death, but the knowledge that you were saved by someone you decided wasn't worth listening to, and that somewhere, quietly, without triumph or bitterness, that man knows exactly what your survival cost. He knows what you'll never admit, that your education was worthless against his experience, that your rank was meaningless against his knowledge, that your whiteness couldn't navigate the water that his blackness had been forced to master. He knows, and he'll never say it, because he doesn't need to. The fact that you're still breathing is proof enough.